with the front pages. We'll press the Independent, which is our first out of the blocks, as usual, and, well, quite a full front page there. Yep. Political matters first. Business chiefs were losing faith in Tories. Power cuts could paralyse the UK by 2015, and victory for the Mau Mau. What takes your eye there on the front?
Well, I'm quite struck. I mean, this is very much pushing forward to next week, which is going to be the Conservative Party conference. And this is quite an interesting survey of business chiefs saying that they're seriously losing faith in Cameron and Osborne's ability to turn the economy around. So it's slumped. Mr Osborne's confidence rating has dropped from 63% to 43%. That's a 20% drop, according to this new Comres survey of 166 prominent businessmen and women.
And David Cameron down to 55%.
Yeah. So this is, I would say that for the Tories going into their big week, given that the economy is meant to be their main, their main strength, or certainly what the whole point of the coalition is meant to be, this is not great news.
The only thing that's missing, I guess, is vote for Vince Cable and Danny Alexander that they haven't tagged on the end of it. I don't know.
I don't think we're kind of holding our breath on that one, are we? Quite.
Where are we with 2 down, 1 to go as a snapshot of our political landscape, Stuart? Is it fairly unedifying at the moment?
Well, I think the whole party conference thing, you know, I can remember when it took half of the television news bulletin, it was page after page. I think we've all just about had enough of it. And you get the feeling sometimes the parties have had enough of it as well. You know, we've heard, you know, the chief whip's not going to turn up. I mean, lots of MPs don't turn up. But, I mean, I suppose everyone's...
I don't think that's because he doesn't want to.
Well, I know,
exactly. Because he's been fully banned, because he's going to, he's on Playboy.
The comparison is obviously going to be between Ed Miliband's speech and whatever David Cameron says. I mean, Miliband's, in a sense, copied Cameron with the walking and no script and everything. You know, in a sense, he's made an impression. He probably hasn't entirely got where he wanted to get to, but he's certainly made progress. What does Cameron do now? Does he strike off in some new direction? Does he, consolidate where he is? I think that's going to be the main thing to watch.
Well, he's got to wear a China suit, hasn't he? Because we had Nick Clegg without the tie and the jacket, and then Ed Miliband had a couple of where he had the tie but without the jacket. Yeah. So really, that only leaves.
Yeah, but
the
that's
tie
bad.
And jacket.
Well, then he looks like super stiff, and he's.
Well, no, it's
prime
ministerial, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah, but I think at the moment he's really. Everyone's thinking he's kind of leading this posh boy cabinet. Can't connect with the people. He's got to really do something to make people fall in love with him again.
What about?
I think that there's a real problem around Cameron. That this week, that you've seen Fraser Nelson in The Spectator taking against him. Peter Oborne in The Telegraph yesterday was very negative. And I think that there's a real sense that even the Tories themselves are falling out of love with Cameron. There's been all the stuff about him being incredibly rude. The Flashman stuff is slightly sticking.
And drinking the glass of red wine when the cabinet minister was being dismissed.
I thought it was white wine that he was making.
Oh, was it? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah,
yes, and that she didn't even get offered one. Yeah. I think there's a sense that things that the wheels are slightly coming off Cameron, and next week is his chance to resell himself and his party and his coalition.
But this is the theme. This is the theme of all the conferences so far. It's the leaders trying to get back on top of their parties. It's not just
he's got the Boris factor, and just Boris is not going to go away, is he? I mean, he's now, there's always a fight to be picked with Downing Street about the airports or something else. Nobody else has got quite that. I mean, obviously Vince is around there. I mean, the idea of Danny Alexander potentially being a candidate. I mean,
exactly.
With slight intake of breath at that point. But
I mentioned both names as
exactly.
But most people out there wouldn't be able to tell you who Danny Alexander was. Yeah. I mean, the reason why Boris is such a kind of scary challenger, really, to Cameron is because everyone loves Boris. I mean, there's lots of people I know who would never dream of voting Tory, but say they might vote for Boris.
But is the other thing, you mentioned the change, perhaps, in the party conference. It used to be a must-watch, didn't it? Yeah. The firebrand speeches. You tuned in the Tory conference to watch Heseltine or whatever and see what the speech was. That's all gone now.
Well, what intrigues me is the amount of management that goes into these things. So you remember Labour had this big Olympics thing, didn't they? Going quite fairly, because they got the Olympics, and there was Nicola Adams in there, there was one, Sebco was there. I hardly saw any coverage of that on news bulletins. I mean, for those who are watching wall-to-wall coverage, sure, you could. So the idea they're putting on this show, but who's actually watching this show? How many people are watching this show?
Well, I think the problem is they're only preaching to the converted. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at Twitter, all the kind of politicarati are all tweeting away about what's going on.
Yeah, it's a very closed Westminster Village now.
I was watching Sky News for 45 minutes on the night of...
Well done.
Yeah, I thought... on the night of Miliband's speech, and it was all about this awful thing going on in Wales.
Yeah.
There was not a mention of Miliband the entire time.
Yeah, I guess that might reflect a change in the modern news idiom rather than in the decline of the party conference. I don't know. But let's just move on to the other issue, perhaps, for British politicians here, which is this court decision on the Mau Mau, or at least those who were arrested in the Mau Mau uprising. And basically the suggestion now that there may be all the other legal claims from all the other areas of the former empire or Commonwealth, colonies.
I think this is probably pretty worrying, and is certainly the idea of a whole floodgate of legal cases is tricky. I mean, just the sheer evidence in this, that it's 50 years ago, lots of the principal players are dead. I mean, the court ruled today that there was ample evidence in the archives to go back into, but it's going to be pretty tricky. But the sheer delight on the faces of these people, I mean, I'm sure that terrible things were done to them.
Well, exactly, and that's the issue, the allegations that have been made. When we have this high moral ground about, you know, terrorism nowadays and people being extradited to the US and so on, but when one reflects on this, perhaps was carried out by British authorities or with accountants.
I'm old enough to remember when Mau Mau was a story, and you know, it's difficult to think that the reputation that the Mau Mau had in Britain for being absolutely ruthless, for
which they were.
But they were absolutely,
Yeah.
and therefore, in a sense, probably in the minds of British soldiers, there was some justification for what they were doing, but no one ever mentioned it. No one ever covered it. And to see these elderly gentlemen in Kenya today and to think, you know, those were the same people that we so completely demonised. Then, of course, they suddenly became freedom fighters, didn't they? I mean, you know, Jomo Kenyatta went from being the Mau Mau leader to being the president of Kenya, and he was suddenly a bulwark of Western, you know, stability in Africa.
And it was ever that. Although I don't think anyone's going to be saying that Abu Hamza's a great freedom fighter.
I'll just press the button for the Daily Mail, because that's just come in, which is the latest on the Savile story. Was there a sex ring inside BBC? Police are to investigate claims that Sir Jimmy Savile and an accomplice ran a sex ring at the BBC. The Mail's been told a BBC employee was allegedly given the task of procuring girls for presenter and other men to molest. Now, this is taking it into...
and then it's saying Gary Glitter.
Well, suggestions that he had been in BBC buildings separately at the same time. So is this hard new evidence, or is it the Mail just trying to...
Well, it's probably a bit of the Mail ramping it up because it's been loving this story all week. But I do think I was very struck by what Janet Street Porter was saying on Question Time last night, and because she was actually working at the BBC at the time, and she was talking about a culture where what women said was completely disregarded, where it was pretty normal for people to be having shenanigans in their dressing gowns with, you know, young ladies. I mean, I think the problem with the Savile stuff is that they were very young. This was kind of, you know, child rape in some of the cases, and it's awful. But I mean, there certainly seems to have been quite a licentious. Certainly, Janet Street Porter was talking about a very licentious culture in light entertainment, where really what the stars were getting up to in their dressing rooms was kind of seen as, you know, boys being boys, and no one was really that worried. And I think that the BBC should be looking at itself in that department, and probably should have been looking at itself rather sooner than now.
I mean, it's fascinating how just during this week the BBC's position has changed. I mean, start of the week it was kind of, you know, what is this all about? And then, and I think particularly after the programme went out, and I thought it was an excellent programme. I thought it was really
this
well
is the
ITV documentary.
And I thought it was very sensitively done. I thought the evidence was, you know, very, very convincing. At that point, the BBC obviously went, you know, completely on defensive, putting aside the whole Newsnight affair, which
Well, I was going to ask, how important is that in this equation?
Well, I think in some ways it's become a much more of a secondary story now because of the sheer sense. I mean, there is that moment in the documentary, for those who didn't see it, where you had a on-air clip of Gary Glitter and Jimmy Savile both with their arms around young teenagers.
Ooh.
And when I say their arms around, I mean it. And you thought, this is really creepy.
Sick,
But then to your point, Ellen, I mean, somehow, because he was interested in children, I mean, there are definitely parallels with Michael Jackson here in the early days, that we thought, well, he's very supportive of children. He thinks children are a good thing.
The whole Jiggle Fix It program was based on that premise.
Exactly. And so, you know, again, a sort of blind eye was turned, but the BBC clearly had to take this very seriously.
We should just add that no one has been named, but the Mail is making the point at the bottom of the page. Last night, Savile's alleged accomplice told the Mail absolutely not when asked if he'd committed rape. because obviously there is a question mark now that there could be people being libelled by this sort of blanket being spread across the BBC, and everyone will be thinking, well, who is it?
But I think that we've seen a lot of very big institutions in our country recently but having to really deal with problems, internal problems, from the expenses scandal to the police over the Hillsborough thing. And I think there is a sense this is a bit of a watershed moment for the BBC, and they've really got to be seen to be sorting themselves out. And I slightly disagree about the Newsnight thing. I think the fact that they canned an investigation into this and their own programme it makes it look much worse. I think if they come out with a Newsnight about it, at least people would say, well, the BBC aren't afraid to investigate themselves.
I thought that earlier in the week, but I have to say, when the former detective who made the programme for ITV said that none of the people he had interviewed had been interviewed by Newsnight. In other words, you did have two completely different set of witnesses. They were looking at certain scenarios. I was only then began to give them the benefit of the doubt.
To come to Newsnight's defence, I think it was the editor of the programme who thought maybe they didn't have quite enough to stand it up on an editorial basis, on a journalistic basis.
I think the line he said was that it's institutional failure. Now, I think the question is, no one has actually still suggested there was an institutional failure, but that doesn't stop them thinking it's a big story.
Yeah, well, I think...
It was about his judgment that says, I don't care about all this kind of stuff. Was there institutional failure? So you could say that was probably a slightly remote kind of editorial judgment, or you could say it was a valid decision.
I think it's a bad call in terms of how people...
It certainly looks that way now.
No, but I think it was a bad call at the time, and certainly the people involved in the Newsnight programme were very angry, and some resigned. And we've actually got a big story in the Sunday Times coming out on Sunday, which is, I think, also going to make Newsnight look worse.
Can you tell us a bit more?
Really. I mean, it's legally dodgy, and it's not coming out till Sunday, so I don't want to go there. But we've got more on this.
Okay. It's legally dodgy, but okay.
No, I mean, it's fine. I mean, I don't want to talk about it now.
It's further investigations into this story.
Yeah, it's further investigations.
Last point on this. Putting your Ofcom and television executive hat on, what does George Entwistle do now as the new Director General?
Well, I think it was rather bizarrely, it was actually, I think, Michael Crick, a former Newsnight reporter, who did a tweet that says, George Entwistle, frankly, pull your finger out, for which I think he had no thanks from his colleagues, either at Newsnight or Channel 4. But putting that one side, clearly George Entwistle is on the case. I mean, I think people are saying, well, where's Lord Patton? You know, he's the chairman. So in a sense, it probably is going to get ramped up. But, of course, their point is, well, we need to get this to the police. I have to say, from my experience at Ofcom, I was in charge of investigations into what were known as the dodgy competitions.
Yes.
People were regularly saying, why aren't the police involved? We were constantly telling the police, and actually...
They didn't want to know.
They didn't want to know.
Interesting. Right, OK. Just to reflect, April's family released poignant new photos as hopes for her fade and more coverage inside, but obviously it is a rather, shall we say, difficult period for a family now as the police have put the murder investigation in place, and of course the search continues. But we'll see what other coverage continues with the other papers. The Express, hooray, Hamza's on way to USA, which is not a bad headline for the Express. There's something to
count our chickens.
I have to say, I tweeted.
Let's wait, he's actually on the plane, and it's out of British airspace, and his lawyers have not gone.
I haven't got my duty free yet.
I was tweeting hoorays on the, hopefully he'll be on his way by the time we get on air.
Well, I think there is proof from our cameras earlier.
Have we got the plane taking
Long Lartin, which was the convoy leaving with the high security vans on its way, we were told, to
Suffolk. They said was where the...
Well, the suggestion is it's a military airfield.
It's quite a long way from Warwickshire to Suffolk.
The interesting thing will be whether the process of transporting him to the United States is under military auspices, because it is a civil case that will be launched by the
that's an interesting element. And of course, the other thing, like, again, with this kind of, this big thing has become so farcical, in truth, that I say, joking apart, who knows what could actually happen when they get to the airfield.
Your passport's out of date, sir.
One shouldn't joke about a serious thing, but it's got that farcical.
Or they might say, your brain scan's going to happen after all. Let's hope he's gone.
I'm sure we will see a number of hook headlines during the rest of the year.
Yes, by hook or by crook.
Or there's been quite a lot of sling your hook.
And reflection, the last line on the Express page, I think 2.7 million is the legal bill that stands at the moment, and that may even go further up.
I mean, I think Hamza's become a kind of bit of a joke figure as kind of hook, but actually he's accused of some really horrendous horrendous
Indeed,
crime.
allegations of, we'll see what due legal process brings in the United States. The paper preview on Sky News at 9, much more to come with more front pages as they come in. Stay with us.